here, I am really looking forward to having you hear from Charlie Schaller. Charlie is joining us actually from the hospital this morning. His wife just had a baby, and yesterday, I believe, or the night before, and he chose to join us anyway. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. Certainly didn't expect that. But Charlie has had one of the more unique job transitions of people that we've had talk about these, and I'm looking forward to have him share it with you. But he's currently at Optum and in a significant role there. I'll let him give you all the details, but really glad to have you join us, Charlie. Thanks for taking the time this morning.
Hey, thanks so much, Harry, and I appreciate you laying the base. I'm a little bit less business professional than I'd like to be for this, but I am coming to you from the Maple Grove Hospital. 36 hours ago, my wife delivered our fourth son, 𝘿𝙚𝙩𝙚𝙦, and so she is, full disclosure here, she is supportive of me being here. I would not take this call if she wasn't, and she is just a few doors down in the process of recuperating with our baby. So really grateful for the chance to be here and to speak to a topic that I think for me has been one of the more personal ways God has taught me about himself, and that's through my career and career transitions. And I think in a lot of ways, it's appropriate that I'm here at a birthing and delivery center, because I think in a lot of ways, transitions in our lives are a lot like childbirth. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the line, we can kind of look at them with rosy colored glasses and just remember the highlights and when key events happened and the first smile, the first sleeping through the night. But as someone who's now back in the midst of the first week of life with a baby, I can tell you it is chaotic, it is unnerving, it is discombobulating. And during this process, I've had to remind myself that there's great meaning and great purpose at the end of the tunnel. And therefore, the sleeplessness is worth it, and the tiredness is worth it, and the diapers are worth it. And that may be an odd parallel to draw, but I feel like for a lot of us, when we go through transitions in life, it's a very rare day that they make sense in the moment. And so I'd like to take you to a time in my life where I walked through a significant period of upheaval, with the hopes that potentially if you're walking through a similar period, you may be able to draw a similar hope and a similar perspective that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months, years, weeks, maybe even down the line, what could be viewed as a very chaotic time would be viewed with faith, and also through the lens of God being able to work even in the midst of craziness. At times, maybe even him choosing to work in it rather than through calm. So I work for Optum, which is a part of the Unitedhealth group. So specifically, I'm Senior Director for Business Planning in our Strategic Partnerships group, which means I get to do a lot of really cool stuff, specifically around leveraging emerging technology for transforming healthcare. So everything from using AI to predict the spread of influenza and COVID, to asking how could we keep seniors in their houses longer through connected devices, mesh Wi-Fi, ambient computing, all these kind of cool words you see on the news. I love it. It uses my passions. It's extremely meaningful for me. 5 years ago, I was in a job that I loved, I was passionate about, I used my skills, and was extremely meaningful to me as well. The time of that transition, that was a very meaningful and significant time, time that actually didn't make a lot of sense to us, my wife and I. So since college, I'm an undergrad from the Carleton School of Management. I worked with Campus Crusade for Christ, or CREW. My wife and I joined straight out of college. We worked together, which was a huge blessing. Had the chance to work with and enjoy working with my wife for about 10 years straight. And we were in a period of self-selected transition. We had been offered a position as kind of a senior leadership over New York City. So we were going to head out to New York. We were going to have a huge city strategy to kind of develop our operations in this massive metropolitan area. We had told all of our friends, we told all of our parents, we'd announced to the groups that we were leading, we had selected our successors and had kind of a public handover. The only gap was I was in the process of getting my MBA. When we were offered this position in New York, it made sense. I had said I really want to develop my leadership skills a bit more on the quant side. Specifically, I was asking questions like, could we finance the purchasing of an apartment building that would make it cheaper for people to move into the city so that they wouldn't want to live 2 hours away, and we could really have a lot of our staff centered there. Anyways, that made sense to me too. I'd applied to the University of Iowa's MBA program, which was 8 blocks away from our house, and had been accepted with a full scholarship. That was awesome. That made sense. And so we were just in this A through Z, every element of our lives being exciting and scary, but also making a ton of sense. It was over the course of getting my MBA that God started giving us puzzle pieces that didn't make sense. It was like every piece we gotten so far, we knew where it went and it made sense and clicked right into the right spot. And all of a sudden we were, instead of blue puzzle pieces, getting red puzzle pieces. And intuitively, we didn't know where they went. And for both my wife and I, as firstborns and the parents of two boys at the time, it was very disconcerting for us to not be exactly sure where these pieces went. Things like, I would love spending time with my classmates. Just, specifically just being able to, interact and love on people from other countries, people who didn't know about my faith, people who I had a chance to really just serve and come alongside, have into our house, stuff that oddly enough in ministry, I didn't have as many opportunities to do. My wife would start saying things like, you're kind of coming home a different guy than you were when you left in the morning. So that's just a piece, right? We didn't know what that meant. That wasn't the puzzle. For us, though, the significant disruption to our plan came in March of 2016, when my dad texted me during class to let me know that my mom was being rushed to the ER with some mysterious rash on her leg that wouldn't go away, but that was spreading. And what we found over the coming weeks was that my mom had been suffering from a type of blood cancer called acute myeloid leukemia, AML, which is not the most aggressive type of blood cancer, but is certainly in the running for one of the worst that a person can get. And for us, the puzzle was not simply disrupted, but destroyed. We were in a position now where we were asking questions, not just what's the best place to live, Upper West Side or Yorktown or in a Battery, but really this question of if my mom is dying, and we don't know if she is, because again, change is chaotic and transition is insane, but if she is, how does that change what God has called us to do? If indeed this plan is being disrupted, why has God allowed us to collect what feels like 50, 60, 70, 80 puzzle pieces that all seem to be pointing us in this one direction? And we started to ask this question of, what does it look like to follow God, to be willing to lay down your life and surrender and walk a path of his will, and then to feel like he has completely uprooted what you think his will is. And so, again, like childbirth, this all makes a lot more sense as I share it today, but for us, it was extremely chaotic. Another significant disruption came when my mom's illness increased and we reached out to the leadership of our previous organization, Cru, which, by the way, very grateful for and grateful for the leadership they provided. But they essentially communicated that due to a broad national organization change, that they really didn't have a position for us in Minneapolis. And so the puzzle became even more complicated. The issue now became, well, if we want to be able to either A, spend my mom's last months with her, or B, be there for my dad, it wouldn't just mean a geographical change of plans. It would mean a complete career disruption. And I would say both Abby and I, we saw ourselves as long-termers, being willing to be on staff long-term. And so considering the transition out of, full-time vocational ministry into a completely different career of any kind was incredibly disruptive. And if you're in a career disruption right now, I think my response to that disruption was anger and frustration, a sense of, God, I've been telling people my entire life that if they trust you and they put themselves in your hands, that their life will turn out better than if they hadn't. And I'm not a big fan of the prosperity gospel, but I even understand as I share those things that there were elements of the lie that I believed in that moment. That if I served God, I was free from pain because he owed it to me. And so in the midst of that process, and Dave, I'm going to ask you just to message me when I have 2 minutes left here, we really felt led and called to pursue a job hunt outside of ministry with the same faith principles that we pursued support raising within our ministry. So I was on staff for 12 years with Cru. Every dollar we received as a paycheck through that, we had raised through fund generation. And actually, Grace and several members of the church were valuable members of our team, so there may even be supporters on this call. But we really had to walk into every day as we developed funds for either ourselves or our team or broader initiatives, saying that, God, unless you move, in spite of our education, our experience, in spite of our communication abilities, unless you move, this train doesn't move forward. And so we ask, would you provide our daily bread, right? And he faithfully did over 12 years. But my commitment to support raising in a faith context was that I wanted someone to look at my work and see my faith. that in looking at how I raised support, how I trusted God, how I stepped out and did something that was maybe even kind of countercultural and then strange in terms of raising our own salaries, that people would say, okay, I get it. When we step out and trust God, our faith empowers us to do hard, crazy things, and a lot of them. And so we decided to really run at the career search, not as an opportunity to rapidly end a transitional period that was uncomfortable, but really as a chance to say, you know, God, we believe that you will work through this search. We give you permission to be strange in this time, and we want to learn from you in this. Difficult and incredibly painful for us to say, like, God, we surrender our future state to you. And my future state was living in Manhattan. Awesome. My future state was getting to work with some of my best friends out east. Awesome. My future state was having a grandma who's at my kids, or a mom who's at my kids' weddings. And I think in the midst of the upheaval of not just family structure, geographic structure, but also the very fabric of what I expected life to be, I feel like God called us in a very difficult and very painful way to experience a season of transition that we would not have been able to learn from had the puzzle pieces continued to turn up blue. Long story short, applied for a ton of different positions, decided to stretch myself and say, God, you've already decided not to make sense, so let's let's get crazy here. And ended up landing a terrific position on a terrific team with a technology company called 𝘿𝙚𝙩𝙚 in the Twin Cities. And incredibly meaningful, had the chance to work with brilliant people, had the chance to really further medical advances. So when I think about losing my mom, which unfortunately we did in March of 2017, I have the opportunity through living out my faith at work to influence the lives of others so that there are more moms in the future. And I think sitting here, I'm grateful for the wilderness period of transition. And if I could go back and tell myself one thing, it would be read the Gospels and look how often Jesus contextualizes the kingdom of God in the context of people's occupations. I don't think necessarily the God of Israel is overly focused on fishing and farming. I don't think that he's necessarily obsessed with those topics, and yet he chose time and time again to talk about farmers, shepherds, fishermen, because I think there's a unique part of our souls that God has created us with that resonate with work. And that when we go through periods of transition, it is not a season in which God has chosen to step away or even to punish us, but potentially an opportunity for us to learn more about his character through this heart resonance in terms of our full-time occupations and our livelihood that we wouldn't have the chance to do. And so I think if I could go back 5 years ago, I would have said, Charlie, you get one chance to walk through this. Look for as many opportunities as you can to learn from it. How will God meet you in the morning in uncertainty and frustration and confusion? And what can he teach you there in the valley that he might not even choose to teach you on the mountaintop? And so for someone 5 years later, sleep deprived at a Maple Grove hospital, that's the element that I'm grateful for, and one that I hope would serve as a blessing or encouragement to those of you who are also in a similar search. So Harry, thanks so much for having me, and it's been an honor to speak.
Thank you, Charlie. Really appreciate that. And as you and I were talking prior to getting live here, that I had seen your work through Crew a number of years ago, and it was impactful to me. And landing then in a role like you're in now at Optum, as I said, is a unique change, but obviously a lot went into it in terms of pursuing God for some answers on that, and figuring out what's the right thing that he would lead you to in your life. And so hopefully that was encouraging to others. Somebody just mentioned in the chat, incredible message. I agree. I am really looking forward also to have Dave Sparkman join us. Dave is a friend, but he is so much more. He, for a number of years, was the Chief Culture Officer at Unitedhealth Group, and changing the culture of a 350 or over 300,000 employee organization is no small task. And Dave was in charge of that transition for a number of years. Currently, he has his own consulting firm called Spark Your Culture. We're hoping to help other companies make those kind of transitions as well. And on a volunteer basis, he is the chairman of the board of the National Crossroads organization. Dave and I worked locally here on Crossroads for a number of years together, and now he leads the national organization, and it has been making a great deal of impact there as well. You can find information on the national organization at crossroadscareer.org, and there's a tremendous amount of resources there as well. But really glad to have Dave talk about culture this morning and trying to help you figure out if the job that you're pursuing is the right fit for you. And he has a lot of knowledge in this area. So thanks, Dave, for joining us this morning.
My pleasure, Harry. Thanks for allowing me to be here. Working with Crossroads is a joy to me. And when I hear a story like Charlie's, and I'd heard Charlie's story before, it's just, again, a reinforcement of why I do what I do with Crossroads. And as you, Harry, and many of the volunteers, it's helping people see that there is far more to life, just as Charlie mentioned, than what we do. However, what we do and how we do it, which is we're going to talk about that a little bit with culture today, is very important. And God talks quite a bit about the theology of work in Scripture. And my take on Crossroads is, in order for people to have faith at work, you got to have work. So we want to try and help them get work. What I'd like to do today is share with you a little bit about how you can determine as best you can whether you are a good cultural fit for the organization that you're considering. And culture is an amorphous term. We're going to get into that a little bit more as we go through. I have a slide deck. Don't worry, it's not 63 slides. It's only 23, and we'll get through some of those pretty rapidly. I'm also hopeful we'll have time for questions that you may have at the end. So if something triggers you that I don't hit, we'll save some time for you to go through the chat room, and then let Harry moderate, and we'll get to your questions. So to kind of set the stage, and I think this was in the advertising flyer for this presentation, how many of you have been in a situation where you've heard the scary words, well, you're terrific, but it's just not the right cultural fit? And you kind of wonder, like, what in the world are you talking about? I mean, did I not take a shower? Does my breath smell? Did I not wear the right clothes? I mean, we get into all sorts of questions around what that means. However, I'd also ask this question: how many of you have actually been in a role, you're employed somewhere, and you realize, I'm not a cultural fit? And you know it both intellectually and emotionally, you feel it. You just know it's not, something's just not clicking. We're going to get after both those questions and hopefully give you some very practical steps to go after. So with that, I'm going to attempt to find my PowerPoint real quick here and get this live, and then get slideshow started. There we go. All right, we've already hit slide 1. See, we only have 22 to go. We've already hit slide 2. We're rolling right through it. So let you pause there and see those questions.
Your slides are not up, Dave.
Oh, that would make it not make sense on the question. Hold on. Let's go in, and it would help, I guess, Harry, if I shared my screen. Now let's go and try it. How about now, Harry?
The whole PowerPoint is up.
Yep.
You want to get to the slide? Perfect.
There we go. Let's try that. All right. Thank you, Harry. All right. So we've hit these 2 questions already. So the question may be, what could you have done differently? What kind of questions should be asking? Is there a process for you to follow? And I would suggest that there is. As with many things in life, when they work or when they don't work, there's something in a longitudinal process that isn't quite clicking. And the challenge with culture is it's not necessarily linear. It is longitudinal, perhaps, but it's not linear. It's not 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Many times it's 1 to 714 and then back to 23. And then, oh, all of a sudden you're jetted over to 233. I mean, if you go back to Charlie's discussion, his testimony of what he went through, you're getting these puzzle pieces and they're blue, but all of a sudden red ones start to show up. And you have no idea where it fits because, at least when I did puzzles, I always had the picture on the box, right? And you could kind of start to figure it out. Well, in life, you don't have a picture. You don't necessarily know where those puzzle pieces are going to fit. But there is a process that I'm going to suggest today that you go through that I think would help. And part of that start is ensuring that you think about this in a different way, perhaps. Many times when we get that, I'm not in the right place, I know it and I feel it, or I'm interviewing and I'm told I'm not a cultural fit, we start to think something may be wrong with us. At least if you're like me, that's what I thought. And the reality is that may or may not be true. There may be things, of course, that we could all do differently, do better, but the organization is what it is. And if you're not the right fit, it's like plugging a 60-watt bulb into a 150-watt outlet or vice versa. And all of a sudden, it doesn't work. And I want you to have this lens on as you listen, or these hearing aids as you listen to what I have to say today, is culture fit goes both ways. And yet many times I've found in the years of working with Crossroads and many, many candidates that there's an impression that the candidate has to do everything possible and many times sacrifice many things about themselves in order to get that right job. And unfortunately, what happens when that happens is you discover you're not a cultural fit, because eventually the real you will come out and the real company will come out, and you'll see that those pieces don't fit together. So several visuals to illustrate. You can pick out which one might work for you. We already heard the bottom right-hand corner where Charlie was talking about the puzzle pieces. The one that I usually gravitate toward is that square peg trying to get through a round hole. You know, and I want to get to the other side. It should work. It should work. It just doesn't work. Okay. You may be that red umbrella in the midst of all the gray, and you're going, man, I know. And you may not even see the color of your umbrella as others see it and wonder, why do I keep sticking out? Right. We're going to try and get after all of these questions. Now, if you're like in today's world, there's got to be an app for that. Well, I checked on the App Store and there's not an app for that. There are companies that advertise they can help you with cultural fit. They're trying to sell to companies as to how they can change their culture. My daughter recently went through and went on a dating app. So I learned a little bit about dating apps, and we saw lots of photos. She was actually sharing this with me. We looked at it as a form of entertainment, actually, and the picture would show up, and then there were things that were said by the individual about themselves. And, you know, we quickly noticed the pictures were always usually very good photos. And the things they said, man, you scratch your head and said, can that all be true? Can they really leap a tall building in a single bound? But even if those things, even if the picture is true, and even if the words are true, well, can we just have a call, do a Zoom meeting, and go on one date and arrive at a sound conclusion where that truly is the life mate for you? Obviously, being a facetious example. But how many times, if you think about the interview process, you're making a life decision on a call, and in today's world, a Zoom meeting, you might start to meet face-to-face, and then you're going to make a decision where you spend the majority of your time each week, all through a couple meetings. How much background work have we done to really figure out what is the fit? What are the puzzle pieces that are going to snap together? And by the way, you aren't given scissors to cut new puzzle pieces. You've got to use the ones you're given, and you are you. So that gets into the question of culture, corporate culture. Let's get that on the table, because if we're trying to fit you, and most of you would probably think you know you, although I'm going to hopefully challenge your thinking a little bit on that today. But what do we mean by culture, corporate culture? And we went through this at Unitedhealth Group to try to define this amorphous term. It could be values of an organization, norms, what we do when no one's looking, what people say about you when you leave the room. That was one of our senior executives' favorite definitions. Could be the character of an organization, the beliefs, the unwritten code. One of my favorites is, well, it's just the way we do things around here. Could be spirit, could be personality, it could be a pattern of behaviors. So one thing for you to think about as you look at a cultural fit is, how does the organization define culture? How do you define culture? And so when we're thinking about, later on, we're going to get into questions you could ask, a very simple question would be, how do you define the culture of your organization? Be prepared, because many people that you ask that question to won't really know. Or they'll start describing it as, we have fun around here, we have lots of energy, we believe that. Okay, and that's all. Remember the dating app, it's easy to say. How do you really find out? We're going to get into that. Ultimately, we also need to remember, not only is the culture fit a two-way street, and getting definitions is very important. Let's remember basically what the interview process is trying to do. And most of the time, the organization's not real thrilled about going through it as well. I mean, if they could retain most of their employees or be fully in control of when they ask employees to leave and then recruit better ones, that would be their epic, right? But we're really trying to figure out, what do you do best and what does the company need most? And if you're able to find that match, it's just like that puzzle piece fitting perfectly into the equation. And I think many times candidates forget what they do best, or they may not even know what they do best, in my experience, let alone what the organization really needs most. Because if you're able to get this match to happen, it's going to be a beautiful thing. Now, if you're like many people, when you think about both sides of the organization, knowing yourself and knowing the organization, most people think, well, I know myself. I'm hopefully going to disturb you with this slide a little bit. What does knowing yourself really mean? How many of us, I'll include myself in this package, can really talk about articulate our core values, life purpose, abilities, our strengths, our distinctives? What are distinctives? Got to go to Crossroads to find that out. Interest, passions, personalities, work styles, all of these things comprise who you are. And many people may say, well, I know myself and I know these things, I just don't like to talk about them. Oh, really? Well, at some point in an interview, that may come out, or there's an opportunity for it to come out. And much like preparing to respond to interview questions, writing them down, being able to articulate it, practicing, will benefit you far more than you may realize. Because it's one thing to have it in your head, it's another thing when all of a sudden you hear it coming out of your mouth. This is why the small groups that Harry talked about earlier at Crossroads are so important. What I've found so useful for people, not to go through this process by yourself. Don't do it alone. Get some help, get some camaraderie, get some esprit de corps with other people who are going through the same process with different questions. And you will, I found every single time I've done small groups, and I've been doing them now for 16 years, there are insights that come out of every small group for every participant. Things they didn't realize about themselves, about the marketplace, about organizations that come out through a group conversation. So, big question, a lot of people think about, and I'm not going to spend most of my time talking about the previous slide, what I know about myself. I think a lot of folks probably showed up on this call trying to figure out, well, how do I figure it out about the organization? So that's where I'm going to spend my time. But I challenge you, go back to this slide again and again and again, because it is a two-way street. It takes two to tango. Knowing yourself is very, very important. So the big question, as I now pursue the organization, how will I find out if I'm going to like it? Well, I'd encourage you, just strike that from your lexicon. It's not about how am I going to like it. It's how am I going to fit. If you think about food, I love food. I love to eat. I like a lot of foods. Food isn't always going to help me fit into my clothes, right? I've got to eat the right foods. There are foods that are better for me than others, more healthy, more help me keep in better shape, and even more. So the same thing is true with the job. You may like the job, but where is it the best fit? Is it really utilizing everything about yourself to where you fit snugly into that puzzle. And you heard Charlie talk about this. He was in 2 different roles, one at Crew and now one at Optum, that he loves, and he actually fits. Let's now see if it's the third one. Is there a contribution? And knowing Charlie like I do, I know he contributes greatly in the roles that he's in. So I encourage you to think about moving from like to fit and then to contribute. Why? Because the importance of culture is trumps everything. Culture eats strategy for lunch. Peter Drucker said that, and the same can be said about job candidates. The reason we started the culture journey at UnitedHealth Group was not because the organization wasn't successful. The organization was very successful. I mean, 40 some quarters in a row of exceeding analyst expectations. I mean, bottom line, things were moving. However, the word about town was, boy, what a meat grinder. If you go there, will you be able to survive? And our CEO, Steve Hemsley, was astute enough to see that, man, I've got the right strategy. I've got the right structure. I've tried several different ones, and I'm pretty locked in now on what I think will work. And he was told, hey, but what's your foundation? What's your culture like? And is that going to enable the strategy and the structure? And so that had us embark on the journey. Well, and I continued to see, I saw culture change. We never reached the pinnacle, in my opinion, of what we could reach. It's a never-ending journey. It's a long-term journey. Hemsley called it a 30-year journey. And I think that's true for all organizations. It's a long-term play. What is your play? And if you think about the importance of culture, how do you get into an organization and not get eaten? I saw a lot of very senior executives who were very successful in their prior roles come into UnitedHealth Group and not succeed. It wasn't because they all of a sudden lost all their smarts or lost their abilities. The culture didn't match up. It was not a fit. Not necessarily right or wrong, it just wasn't a fit. So the challenges are many, and there's nuances to each one of these bullets that I have on the screen. I'll hit a few of them. I found that organizations usually don't know themselves very well. You may say, what is the organization's core values? And the hiring manager may light up and say, oh, I know those. And I can say the 5, the 7, the 3, whatever the values are. Oh, okay, great. What does that mean to you? Oh, now they have to pause and actually think. Maybe they even get that answer right. Then you could say, where have you seen those values applied in what you do? Oh my goodness, now I'm the third question, and that's a little too deep for me. Organization may not know itself. Now let's remember, hiring managers are human, right? They're just like you and I. They have blind spots, they have weaknesses. They're going to make mistakes. Maybe making a mistake is hiring you. Maybe you're better off not being hired by that person because we're filled with fallacy, right, as human beings. Let's just remember that as we go through the process and we're trying to attain the goal of a cultural fit. Hiring managers may not be good interviewers. Harry and I have talked about this over the years, well over 50%. I would submit 70 or 80% of the managers are actually not that good at interviewing. Well, that doesn't really help you as a candidate very much because you're hopeful that they're adept at screening and interviewing for the job that they've posted. But the reality is a lot of those jobs that are posted are just copied and pasted from other job positions. So they haven't really thought through the role that they're trying to hire for, let alone then interview well for that role. Now, you also may say opposites can attract, right? Many of us have spouses that are completely different than we are, and it's a beautiful thing. God made each of us unique and as we can come together. But what starts out as opposites attract may become oil and water, and all of a sudden it dissipates and things don't line up. Also, it's important to remember that an organization has many, many different angles, even a small organization. I mean, UnitedHealth Group, Harry alluded to, is a very large organization, but even an organization of 20 people, well, that's 20 personalities. That's 20 different lenses as to how they look at life and how they approach work. That's 20 different people showing up on every single day with different challenges. And then that's where you have to remember that even though you and the hiring manager may click, you may feel that it's a great fit with you and the hiring manager is not the organization. They're a good representation. And it's true that most people leave an organization because of their hiring manager. However, going in just because of a hiring manager, I would submit, is not a foolproof strategy. All right, so I'd like to cover with you 8 practical steps as I thought through how can you decipher the path forward to figure out a cultural fit in an organization. Quickly realize, of course, there's no silver bullet, there's no surefire approach, but I think by going through these 8 steps, you can start to get that longitudinal process in a linear fashion, although you're going to bounce around a bit, to decipher where the right fit for you might be. Number 1, always number 1, talk with God about this. It never hurts to get some supernatural directions and clues about what he may have in store. And I'd encourage you to watch the recording of Charlie's testimony once again. What he ended up in was not his plan. I want to read for you a couple passages, Jeremiah 29:11, and I added verse 12 in this. God is speaking to the Israelites. They are in captivity in Jeremiah, and he's telling them to have some hope. So like many Old Testament scriptures, we can extract from them to apply it to ourselves. God saying through Jeremiah to the Israelites, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you." Well, he doesn't say, "I'm just going to have a plan for you and then it's magically going to happen." He says, "Come to me, pray to me." I read a book called Whisper by a pastor named Mark Batterson several years ago, one of the best books I've ever read. And the premise of the book is that when someone is speaking to you in an intimate way, many times they whisper. And what do the people being whispered to respond with? They lean in and listen very attentively. So Mark Batterson in his book Whisper uses this verse, 1 Kings 19:12. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, right? He is trying to talk to us. He talks to us primarily through his word. I encourage you that as you go through this transition, spend time with God. Listen to him, not just talk to him and tell him all the things you need, but have a conversation with and have some silence to allow him to speak to you through his word, through other people, through prayer. Very, very important. Step number 1. Clue number 1. Clue number 2, compare core values. Compare your core values to the organization's core values. Going back to a previous slide, that means you know your core values. You can articulate your core values. You've applied your core values, just like you're going to ask about the organization. Like the dating app, is what they say really what's practiced? And is it actual or is it aspirational? When we developed the core values of Unitedhealth Group, we had 2 of them that we thought were very aspirational back in 2010. One was compassion, one was relationships. Those of us on the committee that was working on these were very clear that we didn't think these were actual, but they were aspirational. And so we felt we had a mixture of values, and I was always trying to be very clear with candidates as I interviewed them where we were trying to go to, not that we had mastered it. And I believe that most organizations would agree from their senior leadership that many of their values are aspirational. They're in process. And there are times when they may falter on those. No one's perfect, but if they continue to strive, if they continue to put practices and processes in place, they're going to get a lot closer than if they hadn't. So when we started the journey and we were asked as a committee, well, what were the core values of Unitedhealth Group? None of us even knew what they were. Each of the divisions at the time had different core values. So if you had been interviewing them at the time with the division I was in, Specialized Care Services, what a name that was, you would have gotten one set of values. But if you interviewed with another division called Uniprise, you'd get a completely different set of values. So one of the things we tried to do is eliminate all the divisional core values and come up with new corporate values. And we extracted from those divisions, but a lot of thought went into that. our CEO's fingerprints. Steve Hemsley's fingerprints were all over those. Well, that was actually the easy part. The hard part was going from aspirations to actual. Because when you have habits that have been formed over years from the processes and the reward system, it's pretty hard to change that. And so how do you change culture? One person, one day at a time. Every day decisions are made. And what you can do as you're interviewing with people, and we'll get in, or networking with people, start asking more and more, what are those core values of the organization and how do you line up and fit? Number 3, check out what others are saying. Glassdoor and Vault are 2 places you might check. You might just Google to see what Google has to say about an organization. Maybe there's recently something that's been in the news. Those aren't necessarily true statements in those areas, but they start to give you an indicator. I like to use the comparison of purchasing something on Amazon. And I think we've all probably used Amazon. It's extremely convenient, and it's got a wealth of information there. Well, one of the things I always do before I click, place the order with Amazon is I read the comments from customers. And if it's something, for example, that's a tool or something that requires handiwork, well, I'm not a handyman. If I even sniff that there's a challenge in putting something together, I go somewhere else because I'm not good at that. And those customer reviews and those comments are very, very useful clues to me about which product might be the right fit for me. And I would submit the same thing could be true of the organizations. So check out what the customers have had to say. What are employees saying about those organizations? What are the news headlines saying? Again, not necessarily true, but can give you an indicator. Number 4, and you'll hear this one again and again at Crossroads, is networking. If you have not checked out the book, The 20-Minute Networking Guide by Marsha Ballinger and Nathan Perez, highly encourage you to do that. I consider that to be the gospel of networking. I would hope that every person that I network with prior to meeting with me would read that book, because it'll make our conversation go so much better. Because they get away from the casual cup of coffee and they say, if you only have 20 minutes, here's how you should use literally every minute of those 20 minutes. There's structure, there's a strategy, there's thoughtfulness, there's intentionality, it's deliberate. When you network with someone, what could you do to start to find out about the corporate culture of that organization? Well, it's not that hard. Go back to those 3 questions. What are your values? What does it mean to you? How are they applied? If you ask that question with every person that you networked with about your target organizations, you're going to accumulate a wealth of opinions. And then you're going to start to see patterns that will show up, right? Now, for large organizations, just recognize that divisions, teams, departments are going to have singular cultures many times unto themselves, because we're going to find that a leader sets the tone for that culture. But overall, in an organization, to think that you are going to be shielded from the overall organization by a hiring manager, a team, a department, or a division, I would suggest is a bit naive. The organization will have an overall culture, and as you find that out, it will permeate and start to sift into everything, and it will affect your future. So I encourage you to think through those questions around corporate culture. Get deliberate. Don't need to be overly complex questions. I don't believe in trick questions like trying to set someone up to, somehow fall into an algorithm in your head of what corporate culture is. But there are real questions being done intentionally that can help you quite a bit. Clue number 5, apply a leadership lens. What you permit is what you promote. Larry Sinn, who's considered by many to be the founder of corporate culture, with a white paper he did in the 1970s. He was an individual who started a firm, a corporate culture consulting company called Sinn Delaney, and they were the company that we hired at Unitedhealth Group to help get us started on the journey. They did a great job, and this quote I found to be very, very true. Right? It's one thing to say, here's our values. Here, let me use an analogy. We expect everyone to show up on time. We expect people to arrive at work on time. Great. But if over and over and over again, people show up late and nothing's ever done about it, well, what you permit is in essence what you promote. And if you don't walk in on people showing up on time, guess what? Nobody will show up on time. If you don't start your meetings when you say, people will start to trust that you're going to start your meetings late. And the same is true with organizations, large organizations. This is how compensation works. This is how promotion works. This is how your raise will be determined. This is how you can transfer within the company or not, right? Again, your manager has a lot of influence on that, but it's not foolproof. So looking at the leaders of the organization, what is their track record? Where have they been? What have they done? How have they done it? Is very, very important. Many times the news reports about senior leaders will simply report the results that they achieved. But boy, to go through and find out how they went after it can be eye-opening. I recently heard a webinar done by 𝘿𝙚𝙩𝙚𝙚𝙧𝙢, who is the former CEO for Best Buy, and he was talking about the humanness within leadership and what he tried to do at Best Buy, one from a turnaround situation that then that turnaround led into a corporate culture that is very strong. Highly recommend his new book. So the human side of leadership. I saw that in what 𝘿𝙚 said and the examples he gave. He didn't just quote a textbook. It wasn't academic to him. It was real. And it was real because it wasn't stories necessarily about employees, although there were. It was stories about him and employees and the interaction of leaders with people that were supervised. And that's where you got a feel for the way he led and what could have been the place that you could have fit at Best Buy. And we tried to do the same thing at Unitedhealth Group. So looking at the leaders beyond your hiring manager is another very important one. Another thing that I think is very useful is compare and contrast. You see some examples, and you all have been to an eye doctor where they put the lenses in front of you. And of course, the eye doctor, when I was a kid growing up, I always wondered, you know, the doctor's breath was always in my ear. Lens 1, lens 2, A or B, C or D. I mean, like, okay, doc, get away from me, right? I understand what is happening here. But how often do we not do this when we're looking at an organization that we've targeted? To compare and contrast, or do we get myopic in our thinking, in our lens, so all we're doing is seeing all these wonderful things about fill in the blank company, and we really should get some contrasting going because it starts to sharpen our vision. It starts to help us see more clearly. So if you looked at working at Chick-fil-A versus Burger King, all of you, if I asked you to say, what are the 3 things you like most about Chick-fil-A? Or what are the 3 things you like most about Burger King? Or what are the 3 things you dislike about both? If you've eaten at both places, you're going to have some opinions. Again, not necessarily right or wrong, because a fit is very unique, but you're going to start to see a pattern. If you stayed at a Ritz-Carlton versus a Comfort Inn, very different strategies, very different markets, very different cultures within how you're served at those hotels. If you're a Ford guy or a Tesla guy or gal, again, different products, but also different leadership and different ways that they go about things. So I encourage you, as you're looking at your target company, find another company in that same industry or the same field and just compare and contrast. And you can, this would be a great networking question, for example, as you're talking to someone who works at Target. Let's pick on Target. So, hey, Target, how do you contrast Target versus Walmart versus 3 other retailers, right? If you're going to try and work at Boston Scientific, how do they compare to Medtronic? I mean, you're going to start to get opinions from those people that will help you get a feel that what those organizations are about. Number 7, and there's only 8 in total, so we're almost through. So if you've got questions, we're going to definitely have some time for those. I encourage you to do some reference checks. This is a bit different than networking because it's much more, it at this point is very investigative, all right? It's not just a networking process. And in my opinion, it shouldn't be only for the employer at the end of the process to say, okay, now we think Dave's the right guy. Let's do reference checks on him from people that he's submitted, or they go through the exercise of, calling the former company and they get the standard name, rank, and serial number. I don't believe it should be just for the employers. Some of the things I've already mentioned tie into this, but when you feel like this is the organization that you believe you want to work for, and perhaps, you're finding that target shape up, I'd encourage you to get that investigation lens on and not just go through the networking just to get a job. Now you're really trying to turn over rocks to see what runs away from under the rock, right? What's going on there? And that could be about the manager, and it may be something as bold as saying, could you tell me the names of a few former employees that used to work here? What would they say about the organization? That question usually will freeze a manager in his tracks, right? But remember, it's a two-way street. You, as the candidate, are not subject to just what the organization is dictating. You have a life. You are going to either enjoy this fit or regret this fit. And again, there's always changes within an organization that, you get hired, and 2 weeks later, your supervisor quits, you get a new supervisor. There's all sorts of things out of our control. I would just suggest there's an intentional process we could go through to help us figure this out. Number 8, direct questions. And this is in the interview. Inevitably, an interviewer will say, oh, I got a variety of questions for you, and at the end, we'll save some time for questions that you might have of me. I would encourage you not just to ask questions about the duties, but to ask questions about the corporate culture. And I've got 3 of them on the screen. And I've mentioned 3 other ones, or 2 other ones at least, earlier in the conversation. I would also encourage you that these direct questions aren't necessarily just for the hiring manager. Let's say you're interviewing with 4 people in a morning at an organization. Now we're back to in-person, so many organizations are doing this in person. I would ask the same questions to all 4 people and see what kind of answers you get. If 3 of the 4 people, for example, don't know what their core values are or how they would describe a bad fit in the organization, okay, then you might start to rethink what your assessment is of that organization. One of the things that I also suggest to my small group members and people that I coach through Crossroads is when you receive an offer, I encourage people to graciously say thank you for the offer, but not to accept the offer on the spot. And that's not just so you can talk to your spouse about that, although that's very, very important, but it's so you can get some counsel from other people. And I found that in the process, for you to go back with more questions is very, very useful. Because it's one thing to interview and ask questions when you have not yet received an offer. It's yet another thing when the organization has arrived at the conclusion, oh, we want Dave to work here. Oh, great. Well, I've got a few questions. Go back to the dating app slide. How much do I really know about the organization? Through a screening call, a Zoom call, and then a morning with 4 different people. I don't know that much. When I was at Unitedhealth Group or Arthur Andersen for years, candidates would come through and I'd always allow time for questions at the end. And some hiring managers, interviewers don't. There was a couple people that said, really, I don't have any questions. Those people would go in my no list immediately. After all, I had worked at Arthur Andersen and Unitedhealth Group for years, and I still had questions about those organizations. How can a person who doesn't work there not have questions? So I encourage you to write out your questions, bring in the notebook with your questions on them, flip the page open and read the question if you need to, but come in with some direct questions. And of course, as you know, I would suggest those questions also include the corporate culture, because you're going to start to find out some things that you may not have unless you ask directly. Both in the interview and then post-offer is when I'd encourage you to ask those questions. So to summarize, 8 practical steps that I'm hopeful that you can find useful as you go through to tactically decide whether it could be the right fit for you. I would again encourage you not to minimize how well you know yourself. If you go back to that earlier slide, there were 12 items there that most of us can't quickly articulate. I mean, even if you think about our aspirations can change. Think back to what Charlie said and how he and his wife were headed one direction and then went a different direction altogether. I mean, to go from working at Crew to working at Optum is night and day. And yet Charlie fits at both. So it's not necessarily about what his competencies were, but also includes what his distinctions are and what his aspirations are. Bottom line, no one will care about this as much as you. No one's going to tell you what to do. It's worth the work. You may say, well, boy, Dave, this is a lot of steps. I don't know if I can really accomplish that. I'd encourage you to start. And this is why the networking process, it doesn't all have to come through the one interview with the hiring manager. If you continue to build a file on each organization that you're pursuing, you're going to start to see patterns of behavior, patterns of decision that will help you figure out, will I be the right fit or potentially a misfit? So with that, that wraps it up. I'm going to stop sharing. We'll come back to Harry and we'll see if we can answer some questions that you might have that I might elaborate on in case I not hit something quite clearly. Or you can take us in a whole different direction in case my presentation was off, that's fine too. Happy to go after anything. Over to you, Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Looking forward to getting some questions in here. One thing that you, I think, made clear is certainly the knowing yourself really well is critically important. And that's, I think a lot of times people don't have that self-awareness very much. And what's a bad culture for one person might be a great culture for someone else. Certainly there are companies with better cultures than others, but I guarantee even at companies with a terrible culture, there's people there that love their job, and it's a matter of, does it fit you or not? And so without knowing yourself, you can't figure that out. One question here is, why is it nearly impossible to get feedback from the interviewing process if you're a second runner-up for a job?
Yeah, good question. Very common not to get the feedback. So first, you're not alone. Two primary reasons come to mind, and Harry, we can tag team these questions. I'm sure you've seen some things there as well. Number one, the recruiting process, the hiring process is a frantic free-for-all. Hiring managers are very busy, recruiters are very busy. Everything is driven toward efficiency. So for a recruiter or a hiring manager to take the time, number one, to provide that feedback is rare that they find the time, prioritize the time in the midst of everything else. Number two, many times they don't know what to say, or they don't want to put themselves at risk, or they don't want to make a person feel bad. I think it's mainly the first one and the second one. They don't necessarily know what to say. You know, how do they explain their gut feel to someone? And they're also have been kind of programmed not to provide that feedback because there's some myth that it may provide a risk to the organization. So those would be my snap answers back. Harry, what's your experience been?
I agree. You know, one thing I find too is that sometimes they're reluctant to give feedback because then the candidate wants to debate it with them right away. And so rather than approach it that way, come at it with just a sincere knowledge to learn and improve for the next time around, but don't try to re-argue the point with them at that stage. One of the other questions is, are there assessments that you'd recommend to help people describe themselves better?
Oh, absolutely. There are literally hundreds of assessments out there. Harry, I know you've got some that are for free that are on our website. A couple that I have liked quite a bit is StrengthsFinder. I find to be very, very useful. It's around $20. You buy the book, get a code, and then you have the book that explains it so you can debrief fairly easily. And a lot of people around the world have taken that. So StrengthsFinders is one that I would suggest. Another one is DISC. That is another very common one used in corporate settings that can help give you some insights. Some that aren't as prominent, That I've always liked is one called 𝘿𝙚𝙩𝙚, K-O-L-B-E. And this claims to measure your instincts versus your personality or your behaviors. It's just how you instinctively react to things. And then, of course, there's all sorts of spiritual gift assessments that you can use as well. But I would highly encourage assessments. One that we always recommend to our small groups, and this you can find on the Crossroads website as well, is a Ask Others assessment. And this is simply, I think it's 7 or 8 questions that you can give to former colleagues, coworkers. I wouldn't give it to your spouse that, oh, well, actually could turn out to be some good discussion, but people who know you, who've worked with you, and many times that helps in a qualitative way. It gives you feedback that may help reveal some blind spots. And so the Ask Others assessment we have found through our small groups to be a very useful tool.
Agreed. Feel free to add more questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and glad to put those in front of Dave here. One of the things with our search firm that we really emphasize with both our client companies as well as candidates is to be sure to be asking a lot of questions around values and work relationships and vision of where the position and where the company is going. You may fit a job really well in terms of ability to do the tasks of the role, but not very well in terms of sharing values. And that really is the bigger determination of long-term fit and satisfaction in the job. And too often interviews turn into what can you do as opposed to how do you go about it? How do you make decisions? How do you treat people along the way? And so it's exactly down the middle of what we're talking about here is the importance of understanding the culture fit for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not getting any other questions yet, but you know, oh, here we go. Can you please share your perspective of how a recruiter much younger than the candidate shares on culture?
A recruiter much younger than the candidate, how they share on culture?
That's the way they worded it, but
Okay.
I'm thinking just in terms of how can you show a culture fit or determine a culture fit between the two?
Yeah, ageism is definitely out there. And if you've got a young millennial recruiter and you're in a more seasoned candidate, let's call it experienced candidate, that you should take into consideration as you're exploring what their lenses may be. But by asking these questions about culture, you'll start to flush out what their perspectives are and how well that will line out with what senior leadership may believe will be different. But that goes again to the many angles within an organization. So I'd encourage you to network with anyone you can within an organization, because that way you'll get that blend of different ages, different perspectives, different angles. Take everything with a grain of salt if you're in a different decade bracket, right, than the person that you're talking to, because their experiences, their life experiences are simply different. All of us have different lenses that we carry with us into everything we do. We do what makes sense to us. So what makes sense to person A may not make sense to person B. But the more questions you ask, the more people you network with, the more investigative work you do, you're going to start to get a better sense for the fabric or the DNA of that organization.
We have a question of what's the best way to determine a manager's style in order to determine if they're a micromanager or not?
That's a great one. We all love micromanagers, don't we? Oh, please come peer over my shoulder and tell me what to do. Part of it is I would simply ask them, how would you describe your work style? And see what starts to come out. If they actually go over the top to say that they're not a micromanager, guess what? Maybe a defense mechanism kicking into their explanation. But it's the best way, of course, is to talk to people who have worked with them in the past, to talk to other people in the department, and just to ask the same non-judgmental question. How would you describe your work style or your supervisor's work style, and you'll start to see a pattern show up. And many times you'll see it in their facial expressions. If they kind of wince and you can see the little gears whirring, like, how do I answer this effectively? Yep, that could tell you all you need to know.
Terrific. Somebody's asking, and the answer is yes, will the small groups or workshop or day seminar help us better describe ourselves and questions for organizations, and what are the best ways to research companies? Yeah, all those topics get covered, and certainly encourage you to take advantage of the small group classes or our workshop coming up. Obviously with the small group classes, because it's stretched out over 8 weeks, we have more time together. We can cover more ground in that venue than the workshop, but both address these kinds of questions and encourage you to take advantage of them. Returning to a topic we just talked about a moment ago, but how can seasoned workers demonstrate that they're in fact relevant and aware of one's corporate culture?
Yeah, to me, an experienced and seasoned worker, the best way to combat ageism is energy, and to ensure that you're coming across like you are eager to learn, open to new things, and are not just the old fuddy-duddy stuck in your ways. And, and there's a variety of ways to do that, but most of it is around, I think, asking direct questions, really appearing and being genuinely interested in discovering what is going on here. How does this organization really work? How does it make decisions? No matter what happens, we will always have the fact that people make first-hand snap decisions, right? First impressions do carry quite a bit across. Now, as I've gone through the presentation, hopefully you feel like I have some energy about me, and I'm 59 years old. All right, well, maybe I don't have the energy of a 25-year-old, but I certainly have some passion around this topic and interest in this topic. And I think you as a candidate can demonstrate that same energy and interest as you go through an interview. And a lot of that is based on your questions, but also be aware of how you dress, what your posture is. If I just come in and it's like, well, tell me about your company. So what do you think about corporate culture? Well, that's very different than leaning forward and into it and saying, hey, I'm really interested in your corporate culture. How would you describe it? And that's where that Ask Others assessment and people can help you start to uncover those blind spots. One thing that I've used, I've got 4 young adult children, and if I hear them talking about things that I don't know about, I try to pay more attention to make sure I stay at least somewhat abreast of what's happening from a millennial perspective. And they definitely help keep me a little younger and keep the energy going.
Great. Now, this topic of age comes up a lot, obviously, and while there's no question there is some age discrimination out there, I've seen time after time it's usually something else. And so while it does exist, it's nowhere as common as what people often think it is. It usually is, as you mentioned, Dave, a lack of energy, lack of interest in continuing to learn and develop. And people in their 20s that come across that way don't get hired either. And so it's easier, though, when you're of that certain age to blame it on age discrimination versus looking at how you may be coming across. And so excellent point. Someone's asking what might be a better way to ask about whether a company or manager support a growth mindset as opposed to blaming a team for mistakes?
Good question. Part of it, to me, is always a direct question. Some people may not, much like corporate culture, a growth mindset will probably have multiple definitions. And so to simply say, how does your company demonstrate a growth mindset, will get the conversation going. And then you start to play off of what you've picked up in the interview. If they're always talking about fixing mistakes and you're able to pick up the blame game, many times I've found that the way to ask the question is on the positive side of things versus the negative side of things, which again goes to energy and the positivity that people want to see in a candidate. So I would say, how do you look at accountability within your organization? So rather than potentially giving an opinion about the company being a victim company or a department, or placing blame, if you simply look at how do you hold your people accountable? How do you empower your people? Again, managers generally don't receive those types of questions based on my experience. So it will be a fresh, the brain will start to whir a little bit, and you're going to start to get, I think, more truth out of that than just the standard stock questions. Here's something I would not do, right? When I network with people, when I used to work at Unitedhealth Group, many times they would, think they were asking me a good question by asking about the status of healthcare in America and whatever, to show, I'm assuming to show that they had some type of industry insight or interest in the industry. That was nowhere near as meaningful to me to try to answer as when they would ask me specific questions about the organization. Tell me about Unitedhealth Group. Why do you like working there? Why do you think you are a corporate fit at the organization? And again, you're going to start to see a pattern come out in their answers. If everyone that you ask that question to talks about, oh, innovation here is just incredible. Well, guess what? It's probably a pretty innovative company. I don't know of any company that advertises themselves as non-innovative. We're the dull guys. We're the ones that just don't do anything new ever. We just kind of, they're not slugs, right? Everyone likes to think they're innovative. So to get examples of how that shows up in their decisions and their practices, that's where you start to get whether it's actual or aspirational.
Terrific. Dave, thanks so much. We'll need to wrap up there, but highly informative. I took some good notes myself, and I think hopefully as people start asking these kinds of questions and digging a little bit more into the cultures of the organizations they're interviewing for, they can make better decisions about whether the job's a fit or not. You will be receiving an email tomorrow with links to a lot of the things we talked about that are coming up within Crossroads. Certainly encourage you to go to the website, check out all the different resources and help and events that we have coming up. As I mentioned, the workshop is coming up on July 10th. Be sure to register for that. We'll have that registration link online shortly, but details are there now. And we have a great lineup of webinars coming up for the month of July, and encourage you to take advantage of those. Starting July 1st, we have a discussion about EOS and traction. If you're not familiar with that, and EOS is Entrepreneurial Operating System. We have Joel Swanson talking about if you're interviewing with a company that is using that, here are things that you need to know and how to discuss that with them. If you're not familiar with EOS, it's a way to structure a company and run a company that has traditionally been used by smaller startup organizations, but in the last several years here has really expanded to a lot more companies, and larger companies are using it as well. So it's much more common than we've ever seen before for various reasons. The Twin Cities is kind of an EOS hotspot around the country. And so the likelihood of you interviewing at a company that is using this is much higher. And so he can give you some great insight into what it means, how it works, and how you can ask great questions to be recognized at those organizations. So check that out on July 1st. July 8th, we have Nancy Burke that's going to talk about the art of tactful self-promotion in your job search. Tremendous topic in terms of how do you talk about yourself in a positive way without coming across like you're bragging, and how do you build those relationships in a positive way so people know what you do, what you bring to the table, without you just rambling on about yourself for forever. Great presentation. Encourage you to see that. And then July 15th, I'm really looking forward to, we have a job search networking Q&A panel. We have 5 outstanding networkers, I think, frankly, some of the best networkers in the Twin City area, that are going to be available for any of your questions about networking. I think so often people get intimidated by the idea of networking, thinking it's some mystical skill you have to develop. And I think these guys are going to disabuse you of that idea and show you how you can do it well, effectively, and build your network and find people that can help you in the job search process. It's going to be a great event, July 15th. See all the details, and you can register for all these webinars on the page on our website. Thank you for being here today. Hope it was helpful and informative for you, and hope we can meet at one of our events going forward. Have a great day.